Welcome to another episode of our podcast From Field to Shelf. Today we start with another mini-series. In the upcoming weeks we will focus on some issues related to the topic of politics. And in this episode we will have a closer look at how populism affects sustainable development. And for that, I'm very happy to have three guests with me from the German Development Institute, which is located here in Bonn.
Yes, welcome Mrs. Burni, Mr. Högl, and Mr. Marschall. We are very happy to have you here. And before we start to talk about the connection of populism and sustainability, I want to invite one of you to shortly introduce the German Development Institute.
Ms. Schweighofer, Mr. Liedelbauer, thank you very much for your invitation. We like your broadcast very much, and we are really delighted to contribute to it. Well, the German Development Institute is a research institute and a think tank in the field of global development and in the field of international cooperation. And we are working on different aspects of sustainable development. That means we have a department related to international cooperation and transnational cooperation. We're working on world economy and also on environment, governance, and transformation to sustainability. Well, the Institute is based on three main pillars. We're making some research because we are embedded in global networks on sustainable development, and we also are focused at policy advice. The third pillar is about training, and for example, we have since the beginning in the year 1964 postgraduate program, which is very important for us because many people who are working now in the field of development cooperation are belonging to our network.
Thanks for the introduction. And Mr. Marschall, this year you published the paper Populism Consequences for Global Sustainable Development. That was very interesting to read. Can you tell us a little bit about your motivation to doing research on this topic? And can you briefly outline the current stand of research?
Populism is everywhere. You can find information on populism in the social media. You can also find it in newspapers, on the internet, and also in TV. Well, the main problem is that populism is mostly connected to the national perspective. That means we look to some elections and we recognize, for example, that the share of votes in terms of populist parties is increasing. On the other side, we have the global phenomenon on the rise of populism. And because of that, we looked at our main interests as an institute. Last year, we had a very interesting conversation in our institute on the impact of populism on sustainability. And because of that, we looked into the literature, we also looked into the internet, and we tried to identify whether there is some information on that. But we recognized by surprise that there is not much literature about that. And this was our main motivation for Get Inside, because we think that sustainability in the context of populism is a very important issue.
Yeah, so just to add on that, I would also like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here and talk to you about this very important research agenda that is emerging in the DIE. The DIE is pretty much concerned with this topic of populism and impact in world politics, because this link is still underexplored in the literature, but we know that some types of populism, they can represent a threat to the liberal order in particular those that are driven by nationalism and protectionism. And we also know that they already have some impact in domestic policy. And as the borders between foreign and domestic policies are becoming increasingly blurred, we need to understand how they also impact international politics. So this is why the DIE, as a leading think tank in global development, is also looking very much at this topic right now.
Thank you for giving us an insight on the motivation for delving into this topic. What does in this context the term sustainability mean for you?
Sustainability is a very global term. It's very, very comprehensive. And if we concretely look at the SDGs, we can recognize that everything is connected. The topics are connected, the countries are connected, and the generations are connected. And if we have a closer look at party programs in terms of sustainability, we can recognize that sustainability does not play any role for populists. And because of that, populists focus at the present time. Future is existing for them, but it does not play a role in the current time. And because of that, it is very essential that we just get an understanding of what the populist threat means for people who are engaged with sustainable development. And because of that, we try to get a closer understanding about the essential lines of populists. We try to get an idea about what populism is. We try to get an idea about the definition of populism. Second, if we try to identify what is populism about and what are the consequences on sustainable development, we need some data and information. But the problem is that things are changing. The reality is very dynamic. For example, if we look to Germany and the AfD, just a few years ago, the AfD started as an anti-Euro party. It was mainly a party by professors. And later on, there was a kind of dynamic, and the focus of the party switched. Because of that, we have, from the perspective of researchers, problems to getting this dynamic. Well, because of this overall complexity, we decided to have a closer look at certain case studies to get a clearer understanding about particular aspects of the linkage between sustainability and the threat of populism.
Thank you, Mr. Marschall. You already mentioned that the use cases are of importance for your work. But before we go into that, you mentioned also that you need a definition of populism. Can you maybe specify this definition for us that you have illustrated in the paper?
Well, populism is a very heterogeneous concept. But it's possible, broadly speaking, to identify some main characteristics. In general, populists claim that they speak for the people. The people are the main people, the ordinary people. And opposed to that is the so-called elite. Behind the elite, we can identify policymakers of non-populist parties or, for example, scientists. And these people have the impression that the policymakers and the scientists do not understand them. They do not get what they want. And as I told, populists claim that they have a closer idea what the people want. And therefore, populism is based on an understanding of us versus them. But there are also some kind of problems with that, because there could be an understanding of black and white thinking. That means on one side you have the good guys, on the other side you have the bad guys, and in particular people from the non-populist parties claim that they are the good ones and the populists are the bad ones. There's a problem of polarization. And it's also a problem that the word populist is nowadays used as a weapon.
Ms. Burni, within the public debate, especially the term right-wing populism is very present. What is the difference between right-wing populism and left-wing populism, or rather, is there really a left-wing populism?
As Paul just explained, populism is about this division between the people and the elite. And this division is based on an opposition in moral terms. So the people is seen as good and the elite is seen as essentially bad. And for populists, the decisions should always be based on the general will of the people. This applies both to left-wing and right-wing populists. And I would say that the main difference between these two ideologies, between these two types of populists, is the types of enemies that they target and the issues that they focus on. So I can give you some examples. I would say that for left-wing populists, they focus on the economic power as a threat to the sovereignty of the people. In this sense, their enemies are usually the big corporations, the banks, the economic elite, capitalism as a system. Usually they are pretty much anti the US as well, and against economic globalization, because they claim that this is driving unemployment and poverty. Whereas for right-wing populism, they focus on cultural power as a threat. They search for a cultural homogeneity, and their enemies are usually minorities of different types. Mostly what we see as most prominent today as their enemies is immigrants, right? Immigration. So in a sense, they oppose every element or individual that is seen as not belonging to this common sense of what they understand as traditional or national identity. So just to give some examples, usually left-wing populism has been prevalent in the context of Latin America. So we have, for example, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Rafael Correa in Ecuador. They are seen as left-wing populists. And right-wing populism has been more present in the context of Europe, Western Europe, and North America. And you know the examples all around. So we have very strongly the Rassemblement National in France. The AfD in Germany is also seen as a right-wing populist. We have the FPO in Austria, the League in Italy, Trump, and now we also have Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Thank you very much for clarifying this point as well. Mr. Högl, to now focus again on sustainable development. Which of these types of populism are the threat to sustainability and why?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would argue that the main threat to the global agenda to sustainability comes from the side of the right-wing populist parties and right-wing populist leaders. So globally, we see a rise of right-wing populist leaders who are basically denying climate science, who deny climate change. The most prominent example is US President Trump. Another one, which Aline, my colleague, already mentioned, is Bolsonaro in Brazil. And both of them are fundamentally putting into doubt and into question that there is man-made climate change and that we should tackle this problem. Trump announced to withdraw from the Paris Accord in 2017. Bolsonaro still stays in, but he also opened up the way for massive environmental depletion, especially in the Amazon. And if we look at the global picture, some researchers say that 30% of global carbon dioxide emissions nowadays come from countries which are led by populist leaders. So this challenge, this threat is quite massive and significant. So we have to think about ways how to engage populist leaders also on this problem of climate change, because there's an urgency to act on that. And first of all, I think to think about strategies, how to engage them, we have to gain a better understanding of the positions. So why are they so much opposed actually to climate policy? And we can see that there's quite some spectrum of different positions. So not every right-wing party is fundamentally opposed to climate policy. For example, in the European context, there has been a study which categorized the right-wing populist parties into three kind of types, like one which are denialist and completely skeptical. Also, the German AfD is an example for that. They say in the project program that CO2 is a component of all life and it's not a pollutant. And another example is UKIP in Britain. But the majority of right-wing populist parties in Europe are rather like disengaged or cautious. So they say like the Earth's climate has always been changing. We don't know exactly what is the cause of it. So for example, the PiS party in Poland or the League in Italy has positions like this. But there are also a few affirmative parties in the European context. For example, Fidesz in Hungary. They say climate change is real and we have to act on it. But they mostly point at other countries to act on it. So that's also part of that. And what is a little bit surprising, or maybe some people are not aware of, is that right-wing parties actually are not against environmental protection. Even in extreme right parties, this narrative or the symbol, for example, of the national forest often plays like an important role. So it rather has to do with this multilateral international aspect of climate policy, why especially right-wing populist parties are against that.
In our initiative, deforestation is a huge topic. So maybe you can explain a little bit how the things in Brazil are going on.
Yes, of course. So what's happening in Brazil now is that we are facing increasing rates of deforestation. We already have more than 9,000 square kilometers of the Amazon forest destroyed. This is equal 6 times the city of São Paulo, so this is really huge. And we also saw a record in the rate of deforestation in 1 year, this year, under the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro. Recently, we also saw all around the world, this was in the news, we saw that fires were happening in many places in the Amazonia forest, and many people blamed Bolsonaro for this. So, of course, that is not him that is causing the fires, but I would say that he creates an environment that favors further deforestation of the forest. And his rhetoric and his actions also help escalate some social conflicts regarding the land and the use of the land in the region. And to illustrate this point, I would say that he is doing this, he is contributing to this environment in 5 main ways. So first is by spreading this idea that economic development cannot happen if not at the expense of the environment. So he is really spreading this idea that if Brazil wants to grow economically, it needs to explore the Amazonia forest. The second point is that he's backed by agribusiness in Brazil. So in many ways, he has made concessions to this group. For example, by weakening the monitoring of deforestation by landowners in the region. The third point is his anti-science rhetoric, because he's frequently saying that, for instance, the deforestation data is incorrect. He removed in August, I think, the director of the institute that is responsible for monitoring deforestation. The fourth point is that he has dismantled the state structure that was in place to regulate, monitor, and prevent deforestation. So he has taken some measures that some people say that the region now is lawless, so there's no monitoring of what's happening in the Amazonia. So this favors further deforestation, the fires, without any punishment. The last point is that, as other right-wing populists, he opposes international norms and bodies, so he's not engaged in achieving the global commitments towards sustainable development. For instance, he's always criticizing whatever comes from the UN, because the argument is that nobody elected people that take decision in the UN, so why should we follow their orientations? And also because they are into this conspiracy that these international bodies, they are undermining the national sovereignty of the Brazilian people. So this is also a reason why he opposes any international orientation or partnership.
Thank you. A very interesting insight in one of the cases. Again, turning to German politics, Mr. Högl, you also mentioned that one of the populist parties, being the AfD in Germany, gaining more and more popularity. What tendencies can you see? What consequences on sustainable development do you see, or sustainability in general?
Yeah, so I would say that even though the AfD has gained significant electoral vote in the wake of the so-called refugee crisis, that this does not affect so much the German climate policy. There are several reasons to that. First is that in the German population and in German public opinion, there's now a very broad consensus that climate change is a major problem, that we are in a climate crisis. And the AfD, with its position on denying climate change, is a bit isolated in that, I would say. So, for example, in recent surveys, 37% of German citizens said that climate protection is even the most pressing issue above migration and refugees. And also a majority of 63% said that climate protection is even more important than economic growth. So these are quite strong positions within the population. And we also saw, for example, the Green Party gaining significant amount of votes in the last European elections. And this creates kind of a pressure together with the civil society movement, Friday for Futures, to tackle this issue. And I would say the AfD is kind of in an isolated position on that within Germany.
So a last question to you, Mr. Marschall. That was not a completely negative perspective on the future in terms of German politics on the issue of climate change. Are there any more positive perspectives you can convey on the topic?
Well, our main message is that the current situation of the threat of populism is not the end of history. It can be interpreted as a kind of new beginning. It can be a motivation for thinking about the value of sustainability and to fight for it. And we have many positive signs in this regard. For example, if we look at Germany, there is a so-called populism barometer. And according to the populism barometer, we can identify that in the last 2 years, the populist attitudes in Germany were increasing. But the additional support for populism has certain limits, and that's very positively. But we can also look at different levels in this regard. For example, at the level of governments and the level of countries. There are some countries which are not so much affected by the populist threat. For example, Germany, but also some other countries in Europe. And for example, if we look at the topic global health, we can identify that the US started to decrease its support for this very important issue on sustainability. And we can also identify that in terms of the Brexit, the UK will decrease its support. But Germany and a few other countries have initiated an initiative in terms of compensate for the loss of US and the UK, and therefore they will provide much more leadership in this case. It's also important that we recognize there are also some other alliance for multilateralism in terms of Germany and other countries. These like-minded countries can contribute to input against the threat of populism. But we can also look at the level of civil society. And Max already mentioned the Fridays for Future movement, and there are also some other groups at the level of civil society who have recognized that sustainability is very important. Well, we also have the Extinction Rebellion movement. Well, this is a grassroots movement, and they're sometimes a little bit different to other groups, but we can increasingly recognize that there are several groups with different perspectives, but they can join in the fight against this kind of threat. In a nutshell, we should interpret the current challenge as a chance for critically rethinking the value of cooperation and try to adjust things accordingly.
Okay, now we have a lot of new insights, and I really want to thank you for your time. And well, thank you for listening. And in 2 weeks, we will move on with another episode dealing with politics and sustainability.